I'm very interested in that idea of history from below, and that history is created by ordinary people making things, writing letters, and that it's quite often in the everyday things that those are really where history really happens, and that quite often the things that get recorded or preserved are the unique and the special and the elite. And I think the amazing thing about this house is that it's never really been lived in by rich people, and so really what you have is a record of the lives of ordinary people. What happened a few months ago was there was a special housing committee meeting, and the council decided to change its mind about us staying here. The idea is that I think 2 of the houses are going to be sold on the open market, and the other 2 would be turned into family units, which would probably mean that things like 18th century frescoes and layering wallpaper and things like that would go. And I think it would be very sad. I mean, I'm very sad at the idea of being made homeless, but I'm also very sad at the idea that perhaps one of the most unique houses of its type in the country will be lost. After the media interest in the house, many of the descendants of John Tiley contacted me and wanted to visit the house. I arranged a tour on a Friday evening, and 15 people turned up. Most of them had never met before, even though they were related. Hello. Hello. Hi. Hello. Let's go straight out the back. So I've been going to the press basically, and the council are almost on the verge of giving in. And I've got a plan to turn this into a museum, not just of the Tiley family, but of the whole history of the house. I found other things from the 18th century as well as from the 19th century, and also it's got very interesting 20th century history as well. There were refugees living here in the 50s, and I think there's more family.
But this is your life, isn't it?
Right, well, this is Esther. And you'll have to introduce yourselves to each other.
I'm Esther now, there, and this is her daddy.
I mean, basically, you're meeting your relatives. Basically, at the moment, I'm digging in this area. I'm only digging down to a certain level because there's a layer of bricks, and I'm assuming that that's the 18th century layer. And the soil here is quite disturbed, so there's. I find bits of brass engravings. I find bits of bomb-damaged buildings, cigarette packets from the 1960s. So if I'm passing a skip, I always have a look, and if I see something old, particularly like advertising, I always pick it up. I think you've got another relative has just arrived, so I'll just go and. Hi there. Hello, hi. I'm Martin. Hi. Hello. Hi. But when I opened those shutters, there was a wall cavity, because obviously somebody had repaired the window weights at some point, and they'd smashed a hole through the ledge inside. And I shone a torch, and there was some material at the bottom. There's a pair of them, and what they are is a pair of leggings.
Oh my goodness.
Just pass this round. I'll just show you. And you can see they're very darned, and they've got blood stains on them. So. But the thing that dates them precisely was that inside one of the leggings was a piece of wood with writing on it. And it says George Shaw went to Jamaica, March 1785.
Oh gosh.
You imagine that he was the one of the people who built the house, and he left that as a time capsule because he hadn't actually gone to Jamaica when he wrote it. I'll show you a brass cutting machine which ended up next door, but it's either this machine or a machine very, very similar to this that was in this room, and it would have been used by your family. And this sound would have been a very common sound. I'll just So what we're doing now is we're going to the basement, and basically we took the walls down, and behind it is this amazing 18th century scullery. Yeah. And this copper is where you would have boiled water. There's a fireplace here. A fire would have been lit just underneath the copper, boiled water here, probably ladled it into a basin in the sink. And you see the blue. That is from about 1785. And there's layers of grey paint on top of it.
Is that paint?
Paint, yes, yeah. But that was quite a common colour in the 18th century to paint kitchens. So again, it's it's an amazing room because it's even got the original paint from 200 years ago. There's on the right is where the ash would have been put, and on the left is the coal cellar. There'll be a lot of room for everybody.
It's because it's the empty downstairs room, isn't it?
And if after you've finished, the trees are. And all the things along this shelf here are things that I've either dug up out the back or other people in the house have dug up. Brass engravings. There's a flat iron here, I would say about 100 years old. Electric light bulb box I found on the floorboards in here with a hole. Do you see? And then 18th century chimney fragments, more brass engravings, an M, which I dug up about 2 weeks ago, and ink bottles from the early 19th century. And this is a lovely brass engraving.
Okay.
And then, what I also love is how the walls, when we took the paper off, you can see traces not just of its 18th century, but also the 18th century, but also what happened in the 19th century. Like you can see traces of a gas light fitting here from the late 19th century. So you can reconstruct how things might have looked in the house, not just in the 18th century, but in the period since then. And then this wall, I quite like. I mean, you can see how the paint has been experimented with here. Probably about 100 years ago, you've got a green colour here, and then here is a kind of brownish colour. And what I think is interesting is that green colour is the same as the door that I found outside. So that suggests that perhaps this door was in this room. And this here is a photocopy, a colour photocopy of the view from St Mary's Church, and you get an idea of what Islington would have looked like when this house was built. So although you don't see Cross Street in it, you see the two main streets in Islington, which is Essex Road, which was called Lower Street then, and then Upper Street up here. And you can see the relationship of Islington as a village to the City of London here, because you can see St Paul's here. And in fact you can see all the main landmarks of London as well. You can see Westminster Abbey here, and you get a sense really of like how London at that time was growing. But you could see, there were still lots of fields near London, like you can see Hoxton Fields here. And this door as well. This door was outside for about 40 years, and I had it hung a few years ago, and there you go. Well, I think that the house is fascinating in a sense because it's a very ordinary house, and what's extraordinary about it is that it's an ordinary house that's survived for 200 years, and all the people who've lived in the house. And I think when you start actually finding out about the individual people who lived in the house, you find that they're never ordinary. And I don't think anybody really is ordinary. They're always extraordinary. But it's a humble house in terms that not much money has been spent on the house over the years, and it's been, it's just what it is. And when it was covered up in the 50s, they did a cheap job, and as a result, they just covered everything up. Whereas quite often, if you're in an environment that's high status, it will be sensitively and carefully restored a number of times, which will mean that there's often very little of the original fabric left of a building. So the same with the leggings, that it's an ordinary piece of clothing,
that manages to survive perfectly preserved for 200 years, whereas normally if you go along to a museum and you look at the history of fashion, you're going to see the sort of clothes that would be high status, like, you know, not cotton leggings but silk stockings, and it can be very difficult to get a sense of how working men or working women dressed and worked at that time. But to have something that's so tangible, that survived all that length of time, and that is still in the same space that it was found, because I think what makes the objects special is not just their uniqueness as objects, but the fact that they're occupying the same space as where they were used, and that in many ways the house today has got some sort of continuity, in the sense that the people living in the house aren't necessarily very rich, and that we moved in as short-life tenants, but that because of the work we've done, we've found some sort of context for our tenancy. And really we're hoping, and it's really a long process of negotiation, but we're hoping that these houses will continue to be shared living spaces, and that the people living in them will collectively own them. And you know, I think it would be a good thing for London, because cooperative living, whether it's short term or long term, I think is a very important thing for the culture in London. And I think quite often objects that are no longer of any use, like bits of broken plates, in some ways they evoke the imagination more than things that are immediately saleable. And there was a German philosopher called Walter Benjamin who wrote about how objects from the past can pierce the present. Well, I think he calls it the magic of the everyday. That it's in objects from the past, particularly, that have absolutely no value in a market society. You know, they're rubbish. That it's at that point that when people, like, let's say you have a plate to eat a meal off, it's an expression of a better world, ultimately, because it's nicer to eat off a plate than to eat on, you know, to put the food on straight on the table. But that in a market society, you forget the use of things or their real importance in life, and you think of them like one plate is worth 3 bananas, or the things become exchangeable, and in a sense it empties them out of their meaning, or the hopes that are embedded in them as objects. They are redeemed, you know, they're made, so a Coca-Cola bottle from, you know, I've got glass Coca-Cola bottles that I uncovered in the basement. I mean, of course it's Coca-Cola Corporation, but they're not produced by Coca-Cola anymore. You know, they're an obsolete Coca-Cola bottle, and suddenly I look at them and I just think they're just so precious, because they're not, you know, they've exited from the market, the flow of market capital. I started reading Winkelmann, who was a German classical philosopher and art theorist in the late 18th century, and he used to write about, like, the Elgin marbles and the ruins of Greece, and how the most magical thing about the ruins was that they were ruins, and that all we had was fragments. We were completely cut off from the classical past. There was absolutely no way that modern civilization could ever reach back and recreate. So in a sense it's quite a sad moment, you know, because you think in the Renaissance, you know, people really thought that they could recreate the splendours of ancient Rome and ancient Greece. And then there's that moment, the romantic moment really, in the 18th century, which is mid-late 18th century, when you know, the fragment is seen as, in a sense, that's all we've got. And it's the imagination then that makes up the missing pieces of the fragment, of the fragments.